we look at issues around the budget. Last week, President Bola Ahmed Tinubu signed into law the budget, 54.99 trillion naira there. Some say just say 55 trillion naira budget. If you approximate that number there, that is what was signed into law last week by President Bola Ahmed Tinubu. Initially, what was indeed sent was increased by about 750 billion naira by the National Assembly. Let's analyze that budget now and see the impacts. Of course, looking at the allocation, which one, I mean, the proper allocation of that budget. If you look at the recurrent expenditure, we have it in graphics there. We can have it. The recurrent non-debt expenditure is around 13.5 trillion naira. Capital expenditure 23.9 trillion naira, statutory transfers 3.6 trillion naira, debt service 14.3 trillion, and of course fiscal deficit of 13.8 trillion naira. Let's put this in proper context now. I'm being joined virtually from Lagos by economist and of course an investment banker, Adegboyega Adebajo. He joins me via Zoom. Good morning, Mr. Adebajo.
Good morning, Yusuf. It's great to be online again with you.
Let me hear your takes on the new appropriation bill now that was signed into law. It's coming rather too late. Of course, if you look at our previous experience under the past government, we're having the budget signed into law in the month of February. What's your take?
Well, I'll just say better late than never. But let's cast our minds back. Remember that in 2023, and 2024, there was a point in time where we actually had 2 or 3 appropriation bills running at the same time. Happily, I haven't had any indication that there is an existing appropriation bill that's still running. So let's hope we just have one single document which we're going to use to analyze, to measure, and to see the economy perform by this year. February, late enough, but still good, and I hope a lot can be done before the end of the first quarter. And there are also some assumptions. When you look at the revenue figure, 36 trillion, there's a lot of ambition there, and it's mostly predicated on the tax reform bills being passed as prepared or as presented. Will that happen? Are yet to see. The government's initial plan was that the tax reform bill would have been passed as of last year, and it will therefore run with this budget. So can the 36 trillion be achieved? That's quite a target. That's quite a high goal, but it's important to be able to get there for the rest of the budget to take effect. And reading what the president himself said when he was signing the budget at the ceremony, he said it was christened, well, the budget of restoration. And honestly, I really don't know why we have to christen budgets, because at the end of the day, they just never leave out their names, mostly because of implementation factors. But he did say that it's a budget that would see through recovery.
Mr. Adebajo, are you there? Hello, Mr. Adebajo, are you there?
Stability and growth, and it's those 3 elements that are pleasing, because it shows, yes, what the focus of the government is: recovery, stability, and growth. And yeah, we've got 10 months to try to achieve that, so it is fair enough, and it's a good time to come.
Indeed. Talking about being fair enough, let's look at this amount and compare to what we had in 2024. 2024 was barely 27 trillion naira. Now we're having 100% increase in over that what we had in last year. Do you think we're having these numbers because of the current value of the naira? So when you try to quantify them, you actually you understand that the value in terms of in dollar terms is not far from each other if you compare it to where naira were when we had that 27 trillion naira budget.
You're right, Yusuf. That comes there, but that also shows you the extent to which inflation has affected prices. it's only fair to say that a good number of prices have doubled between the beginning of 2024, or you want to say December 2023, when the 2024 budget was put together, and January and February 2025. But be that as it may, is it a fair budget? What's happened within the budget itself? There's obviously, as always, that increase in defense. But I'm happy to see that a significant sum has been put towards social welfare. And the key challenge here is that for Nigerians, that social welfare aspect is pretty important, because when you're talking of recovery and stability and trying to provide a soft landing for a lot of what is going on, then social welfare is very important and it is key. Another aspect that has seen a significant increase will be capital expenditure, and that's because of the infrastructure projects going. Indeed, the government, the Lagos-Calabar and the Badagry-Sokoto roads. No mention was made of the Abuja Superhighway, interestingly, but let's see what happens during the course of the year. So infrastructure is going to take a significant portion. It costs a lot more. These elements alone in themselves bring about, a significant increase between what was spent last year and what's expected to be spent this year.
Indeed, Mr. Adebajo, another area that I think we should also look at is the amount voted for debt servicing. It's about 14.3 trillion naira. This is a very huge number if you compare it to what we voted for. Recurrent non-debt expenditure is around 13.5 trillion, and of course our debt servicing figure is way over our recurrent expenditure. What do you make of that?
So this has been a concern that first emerged during the time of the last administration. Happily, since 2023, when this administration came in, the debt servicing figures, have sort of come down a bit. But we've seen them climbing again because we've seen the amount of loans being subscribed to by the government. And these borrowings are significant. One can only hope that the amounts borrowed are being directed towards the productive sectors of the economy. Yusuf, if those monies are leading to production and growth, then we can start to see the effects of them despite the high debt servicing. But if those effects are not profound and felt, and we see this so much money, much more than recurrent, going into debt servicing, then clearly there's a distortion somewhere along there. Bear in mind that recurrent, even though lower than debt servicing now, actually includes the fact that salaries were increased. The minimum wage was increased last year. And so this is a much higher figure for recurrent expenditure that is expected to be paid. Despite that, debt servicing is higher than that. So the government really does need to manage this.
Indeed, the government did need to manage it properly. Let's also look at the fiscal deficit of 13.8 trillion naira. What do you make of that? I mean, a very huge gap there. You say we need to borrow another 13.8 trillion naira as well. What impact is this going to have on our debt servicing that you've already said is already way too high?
It is high, and I worry again that if the revenue targets are not met, then what elements of the budget will be prioritized and which ones will be downgraded, so to say. And if something is of high priority and the revenue is in there, then that's going to lead us to borrowing again. And it just goes back. I'm almost going to be like repeating myself, Yusuf, saying that is of concern. But you are right. That deficit is something to keep an eye on. Do we want to start borrowing again? It's that much worrisome. If we then find that in 2026 the debt servicing figure is higher, if we keep on borrowing and we have to repay, and we find that that starts to affect the exchange rates and the stability of the naira that has been achieved, then again we start asking questions. But where this is a plan, a budget is always a plan. The appropriation bill is a plan, and it's of course subject to amendment and subject to change. And I want to believe that those entrusted with implementing different aspects of this budget will see to it that they do the right thing in the right circumstances as we go along.
Indeed, Mr. Adebajo, when are we ever going to have a balanced or a surplus budget?
Balanced budget.
We'll be having deficit budget as long as I can actually remember.
Well, so you, yes, Yusuf, so this is a very interesting thing, and economists will tell you there's nothing wrong with borrowing, and truly there's nothing wrong with borrowing. And really, when you look at corporations, companies themselves, they often borrow to be able to achieve growth, and it's pretty much the same thing with a country. I was looking at some statistics today, and it turns out that China has used in 6 years much more cement, about 3 times as much cement as America has used in the last 100 years. In 6 years, China has. Now, did China borrow? China is holding a large portion of debt in dollars. Okay, and that's one of the reasons why they've been able to achieve the growth they have. But that money has turned into production. It's productivity. China is a golden example of how to grow an economy today. It's no more the US. So let's then bring this back home and ask ourselves, for every dollar that comes in borrowed, how much naira is it going to yield in terms of production? And when that naira is provided as a yield, does it create growth? Growth in terms of jobs, that's employment. Growth in terms of improvement in living standards, that's enhancement of salaries. Growth in terms of provision of social or civil amenities, electricity, water, good roads, growth in terms of standards and quality, which we see in our educational institutions, and growth in terms of a more peaceful, a more secure environment. And that's the target. That's where we're going. Those are the things we should be using money for. So yes, we all should make the noise you're making, asking about these amounts and what's happening and why we're having to borrow so much and pay so much.
Indeed, let's look
so that the government remains in focus.
Indeed.
Yes, please go ahead, Yusuf.
We need to put the government on the toe, and of course ask a relevant question to see how we can indeed get out of the current economic situation, and of course build a better life for future generation. Mr. Adebajo, let's look at the allocation to various sectors. Security and of course defense take the largest chunk there of 9.87%, followed closely by infrastructure 8.16%. Education came third, 7.08%, and of course health taking a meager 4.99%. These are the top 4 highest sectors that get allocation. Give me your analysis of what do you think was the thinking of government in allocating this kind of percentage to these various sectors?
Well, it typically will show priority. It would show focus. Yes, well, health is the list of the top 4, but it doesn't mean that health has been relegated in those terms. And the best way to compare these, unfortunately, I don't have the figures in front of me, is to look at 2024 allocation and to check the increases with 2025. A lot has been said about health.
Mr. Adebajo.
Sadly,
Mr.
it's
Adebajo.
for some reason it's not.
Mr. Adebajo.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you can hear me, if you look at the
Yes, I can hear you.
there is a decline. I mean, the defense was actually reduced. In 2024, it was around 12.0%. I mean, in 2023, 12.0%. In 2024, it was 13.38%. And of course, now it has been reduced to 9.87%. Is it that we are winning in the area of insecurity that we don't need to invest more in defense and security?
Well, it does make sense to reduce defense. And again, if I refer to the president's address when he was signing, he actually did not mention defense as one of the key things. There was a lot more talk about food security than insecurity. And I think it's really fair to say that the armed forces have done exceedingly well on the fronts where there is insecurity, and they know exactly what to do in this instance. And some people say they've always known. So that's a welcome development to see that. You will know that for many years we tend to see defense increasing and rising and taking the lion's share. So this decline, as slight as it is an indication of what's happening.
Indeed, let's also look at infrastructure. Infrastructure witnessed an increase from 6.63% in 2024 to 8.16%, indicating reallocation of fiscal priorities, of course, towards capital projects at the expense of human capital development. Mr. Adebajo.
Well, I guess human capital development comes in many ways. Infrastructure requires significant project management capacity, and if you've got companies hiring Nigerians working on those projects, in that area at least you would have a fair degree of human capacity development, as much as you would have the infrastructure being built. Yes, we know what's taking the infrastructure. I spoke to that earlier. But specifically where human capital development is concerned in the national budget, it tends to figure in different elements, in different aspects, in different ways. And that's the way it has always tended to be.
Okay, when you look at the amount allocated to education, and of course there's still concern about the number of out-of-school children there, it has actually moved up from 15% in 2023 to 25.60% in 2024. And of course, people are saying that there's need for an increased investment in education infrastructure like teaching, and also targeting policies such as conditional cash transfer to improve access. Do you agree that, of course, we are not doing so much in terms of allocation to Ministry of Education?
I'm totally with that, and I must confess here, Yusuf, I have a bias where this is concerned. I feel there's a lot more that the government ought to do where education is concerned, particularly when you look at the cases of our public secondary schools and universities, for that matter. It's important that there is some fair degree of focus. If not on what I refer to as old reputable universities, the ABU, UNN, IFE, UI, UNILAG sets of universities, need to bring them up to a standard where they ought to be. If private universities can do what they're doing to get to that standard, I think, first of all, there should be a strategic approach to improving what we have at the tertiary level. But then again, even at secondary level, this is not the time to tweak with the number of years spent at each level. This is the time to start looking at, one, the relevance of the curriculum, the depth and quality of teaching and providing that human resource to be able to deliver that teaching and training. And I use the word training particularly consciously. and then so that the people leaving secondary to go into universities are well equipped to do so and to come out and do something useful with it. We're in a very, very interesting time, Yusuf, and the products of our universities in the next 10 to 15 years are going to really determine the position Nigeria is going to take in another 30, 35 years in the technology sector in the world. And it's the technology revolution we're living in right now. So it's key.
Indeed.
Like I said, I have a bias for the education sector.
Indeed, very, very important there. Like you rightly said, we need to invest so much in education. Let's look at the key assumptions now from the budget. Of course, the crude oil price is still around $75 per barrel based on the budget benchmark, but the current price is just less than that. It's about $72 as of today. Of course, the exchange rate is still around 1,500, which I think we are beginning to achieve that now. What do you make of this key assumption? Do you think in the long run we'll be able to, achieve this target and, of course, have a very good budget at the end of the year?
Well, Yusuf, I'm going to need a crystal ball, and I'm going to need to be able to totally understand what's going to happen in Eastern Europe and in the Middle East, to be able to speak categorically to that. But we've always found a situation where the assumption of the crude oil price tends to be higher than reality. But there's a lot that's happening in the world that if it proceeds along a certain direction, then it is not unlikely that 75 will be attained. Now, is this conservative or is this very optimistic? I say it's optimistic. And I think in the world today, given the way things are going, perhaps we should be a lot more conservative because there's a lot of unpredictability. It's what's going to happen in the internal relationships in the Western world, where Asia would move to and where Eastern Europe, particularly Russia, will move to, and how all this is going to come together to affect the price of oil. Revenue is a key fundamental to our capacity to implement this budget. And I did say earlier that it's a pretty ambitious revenue target set. And there's so many things in the assumptions that one can really consider as perhaps on very thin ice, so to say. They can easily fall through. And that's, for me, is a concern. So the big question is, what happens if the assumed revenue targets are not met? What's going to be prioritized in terms of what we ought to be spending money on and what's going to be relegated in terms of, saying later on we would look to that. Can we really achieve the revenue targets? It's just going to be hope, and hope is not a plan, really.
Indeed, we hope is indeed not a plan, but we'll continue to be hopeful for better things to come, and of course, better Nigeria as well. I must thank you for your time at Adegboyega, Adebajo, Economist, and of course, investment banker, speaking to us all the way from Lagos. Thank you for your time.
You're welcome, Yusuf. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
All right. With that is a wrap on the show today. We'll be back again tomorrow. I am Yusuf Akogu.